August the 7th, 1943, 7:42 a.m., Dobodura Airfield, New Guinea. The tropical sun has barely crested the horizon, yet the air already shimmers with oppressive heat and humidity that clings to your skin like a second layer of clothing. The scent of high-octane aviation fuel hangs thick in the breeze, mixed with the sharp metallic tang of hot engine oil, hydraulic fluid, and the underlying rot of the dense jungle pressing in on all sides of the makeshift runway. Palm fronds rustle faintly in the distance, but the dominant sounds are the throaty rumble of Allison engines spooling up, the clatter of ground crew tools, and the occasional shout of orders cutting through the early morning din. Technical Sergeant James McKenna crouches low under the left wing of a P-38 Lightning, his grease-stained coveralls already dark with sweat at the armpits and back. His calloused fingers rest lightly on the cool aluminum skin of the wing as he watches Lieutenant Robert Hayes, the 23-year-old pilot, make his final cockpit checks. Hayes is a farm kid from Iowa, fresh-faced and earnest, with the lean build of someone who grew up working the land rather than in the air. 6 combat missions under his belt, yet 0 confirmed kills. Today, intelligence reports confirm 18 Mitsubishi A6M, 0 fighters have been vectored to intercept the morning patrol over the Huon Gulf. Hayes will fly straight into them. McKenna knows the aircraft beneath his hands intimately. He has maintained these P-38 Lightnings for 8 grueling months in this sweltering corner of the Southwest Pacific. The twin-engine fighter is a technological marvel, distinctive twin-boom tail design, capable of blistering straight-line speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour at altitude, a true beast when diving from on high with its 450 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon hammering out destruction. But McKenna also knows its one fatal flaw, the weakness that has been killing American pilots daily. The Zero is lighter, far more agile, its controls responsive in ways the heavier P-38 cannot match. In a twisting dogfight, the Zero can complete a full horizontal turn in roughly half the time the Lightning requires. That gap spells death. Official doctrine drilled into every pilot is absolute. Never turn with a Zero. Never try to outmaneuver it in the horizontal plane. Exploit speed and altitude instead. Dive in hard from above, line up the shot, fire, then zoom climb away before the enemy can react. Hit and run. Stay out of a sustained turning fight at all costs. Yet Hayes has attempted to follow that doctrine 5 times now, and it has failed him each time. The Zeros are cunning adversaries. They bait the P-38s into committing to a turn, then slice inside the wider radius with their superior roll rate, latch onto the tail, and deliver the killing burst of 20mm cannon fire. The 5th Air Force has lost 37 P-38s in the past 6 weeks alone, the majority torn apart after being trapped in those inescapable turning engagements. McKenna has witnessed too many of these tragedies firsthand. He has seen good men, barely more than kids, stride out to their aircraft with forced confidence, joking about California girls or home-cooked meals, only to return draped in tarps or not at all. The training manuals and instructors blame it on pilot error, insisting the men failed to adhere strictly to hit-and-run tactics. But McKenna knows better. The problem runs deeper, into the very mechanics of the aircraft he maintains every dawn. The P-38's aileron control cables snake through the twin booms to the tail section, then forward via a series of pulleys to actuate the wing control surfaces. There is slack in that system, perhaps 3/8 of an inch at full deflection. In high-speed dives, the delay is negligible, but during the frantic, low-speed maneuvers of a dogfight, that fraction of a second lag between stick input and aileron response becomes lethal. It prevents the pilot from rolling inside the Zero's turn radius quickly enough. McKenna mentioned this to the engineering officer 2 months earlier, describing the issue in detail during a late-night inspection. The officer had dismissed it curtly. Cable tension was within factory specifications. Altering it would void Lockheed's warranty, and no field mechanic held authorization to touch flight control systems. Such changes required formal engineering approval from Lockheed headquarters, 7,000 miles away in Burbank, California. Desperation had driven McKenna to act alone. The night before, using a 6-inch length of high-tensile piano wire salvaged from a wrecked aircraft's rudder trim, he had bent it into a precise Z-shape with pliers in the dim light of the maintenance hangar. It took 8 meticulous minutes to fashion and install the inline tensioner on Hayes's left aileron cable, adding just 0.4 pounds of preload to eliminate the slack entirely. The modification was invisible, tucked deep inside the boom. No one had noticed during the hurried pre-dawn fueling and arming. The inspection crew focused on oil levels, ammunition belts, and propeller pitch settings. As Hayes settles into the cockpit, adjusts his harness, and signals for startup, the twin propellers blur into shining discs with a rising howl that drowns out the jungle insects. McKenna straightened slightly, wiping sweat from his brow, his stomach tight with unspoken fear. The P-38 taxis slowly toward the runway threshold, its booms gleaming in the slanting sunlight. Hayes waves once, a quick, determined gesture, before advancing the throttles. The fighter accelerates down the pierced steel planking runway, lifts off gracefully, and banks northwest into the brightening sky, joining the formation of 16 other lightnings. McKenna stands motionless on the flight line, the roar fading into the distance, the smell of exhaust lingering. What unfolds in the next 17 minutes could alter the fate of every P-38 in the theater or end in another empty bunk. But this wasn't the first time McKenna had sent a pilot into battle, knowing the odds were stacked against him. It had started back on July 9, 1943. Lieutenant David Chen, a bright-eyed 24-year-old from Sacramento, had only been in New Guinea for 3 weeks. Chen was one of the friendlier pilots. He and McKenna often talked about cars while McKenna worked on his Lightning. Both men had been mechanics before the war. Chen took off that morning full of confidence for a fighter sweep over the Solomon Sea. He returned 2 hours later with 3 neat bullet holes punched through his left boom and a haunted look in his eyes. Chen told McKenna the story while the ground crew swarmed over his damaged fighter. A lone Zero had gotten inside his turn during a dogfight. Chen had tried to roll hard and dive away exactly as the manual instructed, but the P-38 felt sluggish, like there was a half-second delay between moving the stick and the wings actually rolling. That tiny hesitation gave the Zero pilot just enough time to lead him perfectly. Only his wingman's timely intervention saved him. McKenna inspected the bullet holes himself. Tight grouping, classic deflection shooting. Chen should have escaped, unless the airplane hadn't responded fast enough. 3 weeks later, Chen was dead, shot down over a bow in another P-38, caught once again in a turning fight he couldn't roll out of in time. Then came Captain William Morrison. Morrison was no rookie. He was a respected flight leader with 11 confirmed kills. On August 3rd, his flight tangled with 8 Zeros over Oral Bay. Morrison quickly shot down one on the first diving pass, but when 2 Zeros reversed on him, he tried to roll inverted and split SOA. Over the radio, his voice cracked with frustration. Controls feel mushy. The Zero stayed glued to him through the maneuver and shredded his Lightning at 4,000 feet. Morrison's crew chief, Rodriguez, tore the wrecked aircraft apart looking for a mechanical failure. Everything checked out perfectly: cable tension, rigging, everything within factory specs. The official report blamed pilot error in defensive maneuvering. Rodriguez and McKenna both knew better. By mid-August, the pattern had become brutally clear. 17 pilots had died in just 6 weeks. McKenna had personally worked on nearly every one of their aircraft. The survivors all told the same story. The P-38 felt slow to roll during hard maneuvering. Most pilots assumed that was simply how the heavy Lightning handled. But McKenna knew the truth. The problem was in the control cables. The long aileron cables ran through the twin booms, across multiple pulleys, and finally to the wing control surfaces. Factory specifications allowed for a small amount of slack, roughly 3/8 of an inch. In normal flight, it was barely noticeable. But in the violent, life-or-death twisting of a dogfight, that microscopic delay meant the difference between life and death. The Zero could reverse direction faster. The P-38 could not keep up. Every evening, McKenna would sit with Rodriguez, frustrated and angry. The pilots knew the doctrine. They tried to follow it, but combat refused to cooperate. The Zeros kept forcing turning fights, and the P-38s kept losing. Then, on the evening of August the 16th, Lieutenant Robert Hayes walked into the maintenance area looking for McKenna. His face was pale, eyes hollow. He had just lost his best friend and wingman, Lieutenant Thomas Parker, 2 days earlier. Parker had been torn apart by 2 Zeros after screaming over the radio that his airplane wasn't turning fast enough. Hayes looked McKenna straight in the eye and asked the question that changed everything. Is there anything at all, you can do to make this plane roll faster? He didn't care if it was against regulations. He just wanted a fighting chance to survive. McKenna stared at the young pilot for a long moment, then gave a single nod. "Come back in the morning," he said quietly. I'll see what I can do. That night, alone in the dimly lit maintenance hangar, Technical Sergeant James McKenna made a decision that could cost him his career or save lives. That night, alone in the dimly lit maintenance hangar, Technical Sergeant James McKenna made a decision that could cost him his career or save lives. The maintenance area at Dobodora was quiet after 2,300 hours. Most of the ground crew had collapsed into their bunks, exhausted from another day of fighting the jungle humidity, the constant threat of Japanese night raiders, and the endless cycle of patching up battle-damaged lightnings. The only sounds were the distant rumble of portable generators powering the airfield lights and the incessant buzz of tropical insects throwing themselves against the overhead bulbs. The air inside the hangar was thick with the smells McKenna had come to know too well. Engine oil, hydraulic fluid, the faint sweetness of high-octane avgas, and the earthy rot of mildew creeping into every canvas tarpaulin. The P-38 assigned to Lieutenant Hayes sat silent in its revetment, its twin booms casting long shadows across the concrete floor under the weak electric lights. McKenna moved with purpose but without haste. He pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, gathered his tools, a pair of needle-nose pliers, a small flashlight, a clevis pin extractor, and approached the left boom of the fighter. The aluminum skin was still warm from the day's brutal sun, radiating heat like a living thing. He popped the inspection panel with a soft click, the metal edge biting into his already blistered fingers. Inside, the aileron control cable ran taut through a series of pulleys toward the tail section. McKenna reached in with both hands, gripping the cable firmly and pulling it hand over hand. There it was, that telltale play, roughly 3/8 of an inch of slack before the tension caught. At high speeds, it vanished into insignificance, but in the violent gyrations of combat, it created a fatal hesitation. He retrieved the 6-inch length of high-tensile piano wire from his personal tool bag, the piece he had salvaged weeks earlier from a ground-looped Lightning destined for the scrap heap. The wire was stiff and unforgiving. Sitting cross-legged on the oily concrete, McKenna used the pliers to bend it into a precise Z shape. The first attempt slipped. The wire fought back, slicing a shallow cut across his thumb. Blood welled up immediately, mixing with the grease on his hands and making the metal slippery. He wiped it on his coveralls and tried again, his fingers aching from a full day of wrenching on engines and control surfaces. It took 8 long minutes to get the bends right, each angle calculated to act as an effective inline tensioner without stressing the cable beyond limits. Installation proved even trickier. The space inside the boom was cramped, barely wide enough for his arm and shoulder. McKenna wedged himself in awkwardly, flashlight clenched between his teeth, its beam dancing erratically across the pulley system. Sweat poured down his back despite the cooling night air, stinging the fresh cut on his thumb. He disconnected the cable at the pulley junction, fumbling with the clevis pin. It slipped from his bloody fingers and bounced deep into the boom's recesses. Heart pounding, he spent agonizing minutes groping blindly in the darkness until his fingertips found the tiny pin wedged against a structural rib. Every second carried the weight of potential disaster. If the engineering officer discovered this unauthorized modification to a critical flight control system, McKenna faced court-martial, dishonorable discharge, perhaps even Leavenworth. The piano wire was non-standard, the tension unapproved, the entire procedure a blatant violation of Army Air Force's maintenance regulations. Yet the alternative was worse. Another pilot like Hayes climbing into a machine that couldn't keep up when it mattered most. Finally, he inserted the Z-shaped tensioner between the cable end and the pulley, forcing the clevis pin back into place. The fit was tight. He had to hammer it gently with the heel of his hand. When it seated, McKenna tested the tension manually, pulling hard on the cable. No slack. The aileron surface snapped to attention instantly at the slightest input. Perfect response. He replaced the inspection panel, torqued the fasteners, wiped away any traces of blood or grease, and gathered his tools. By 0115, he slipped out of the hangar into the humid tropical night. Distant aircraft engines droned somewhere overhead, likely Japanese night raiders probing the airfield. The sound tightened his stomach further. McKenna returned to his bunk but found no sleep. He lay staring at the canvas ceiling of the tent, replaying every step, wondering if the added 0.4 pounds of tension would hold under combat stress, or if it would cause the cable to snap at the worst possible moment. Dawn came too soon. At 0630, he was back on the flight line, watching the armorers load belts of 50 caliber ammunition and the 20mm cannon shells into Hayes's P-38. The young lieutenant appeared for his briefing, face set with quiet determination. McKenna said nothing about the modification. He simply nodded as Hayes climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and signaled for engine start. At 0742, the twin Allisons roared to life. The Lightning taxied out, its props blurring into silver discs, and lifted off into the morning sky, banking northwest to join the formation heading toward the Huon Gulf and the waiting Zeros. McKenna stood rooted to the flight line, the smell of exhaust burning in his nostrils, waiting for whatever came next. McKenna stood rooted to the flight line, the smell of exhaust burning in his nostrils, waiting for whatever came next. High above the steaming jungles of New Guinea, the formation of 17 P-38 Lightnings climbed steadily northwest toward the Huon Gulf. Lieutenant Robert Hayes flew in the number 3 position of his element, the modified Lightning feeling solid beneath him as the twin Allisons thrummed at full power. The air grew cooler and thinner with altitude, the oppressive ground humidity giving way to the crisp bite of 13,000 feet. Sunlight glinted off the polished aluminum booms and wings, turning the flight into a shimmering arrowhead pointed straight at the enemy. Hayes's hands rested lightly on the yoke, his eyes scanning the horizon through the gun sight. Every briefing had hammered the same message: dive, shoot, zoom away, never linger in a turn. But after watching Parker die screaming over the radio 2 days earlier, those words rang hollow. At 8:14, the call came crackling over the radio. Bogies, 12 o'clock low, 18 zeros at 9,000 feet. The enemy formation was a loose gaggle of Mitsubishi A6Ms, their green and brown camouflage stark against the turquoise waters of the Gulf below. The morning sun sat squarely behind the American flight, blinding the Japanese pilots as the P-38s rolled into their dive. Hayes picked out a trailing Zero, its red rising sun insignia vivid on the fuselage. He pushed the nose down, throttles firewalled, airspeed climbing rapidly to 380 miles per hour. The wind howl rose to a scream around the canopy. The target swelled in his sight picture. Hayes could make out the pilot's helmeted head turning frantically as the diving Lightning closed the distance. He squeezed the trigger. The 450 caliber Brownings and the single 20mm cannon erupted in a synchronized thunder, spitting tracers that reached out like fiery fingers. Most rounds missed, stitching the sea below, but several sparked off the Zero's wing root. The Japanese fighter snap rolled right and dove sharply, trying to break away. Hayes rolled to follow. This was the moment of truth. He felt it instantly, the difference. The yoke moved under his hands, and the Lightning responded without hesitation, no lag, no mushy delay. The ailerons bit the air sharply, snapping the big fighter through 90 degrees of bank in what seemed half the usual time. The nose dropped cleanly, aligning perfectly on the fleeing Zero. Hayes had never felt his P-38 react like this before. It was as if the airplane had been freed from invisible chains, executing his commands the instant they were given. He pressed the trigger again, a tight 3-second burst. The rounds walked up the Zero's fuselage from tail to cockpit. The enemy engine detonated in a fireball of black smoke and flaming debris. The Mitsubishi rolled inverted and plunged toward the jungle canopy far below. No time to celebrate. Hayes's wingman shouted over the radio, "Zeros diving from above, 3 o'clock high." He glanced up to see 3 enemy fighters screaming down in a shallow dive, seeking revenge for their comrade. They were gaining fast. Doctrine screamed at Hayes to shove the throttles forward, climb away, use the Lightning's superior zoom capability to escape. But the Zeros were too close, too aggressive. Running would mean death today. Every instinct warred within him, but desperation won. Hayes rolled hard left and pulled back on the stick. The P-38 snapped around with astonishing agility, the nose slicing through the horizon in a blur. The lead Zero had begun its own reversal, expecting the usual sluggish P-38 response. But Hayes's fighter had already reversed direction faster than the enemy pilot anticipated. The Japanese fighter was suddenly exposed, its turn too wide, its belly vulnerable. Hayes pulled lead, fired. Cannon shells and machine gun rounds hammered into the Zero's left wing root. The wing folded like paper. The fighter tumbled wildly, shedding pieces as it spiraled down. 2 kills in under 30 seconds. Adrenaline surged through Hayes's veins, his flight suit drenched in sweat, hands trembling on the controls. The remaining 2 Zeros tried to scissor, alternating sharp turns to force an overshoot. Hayes stayed locked in. Each time they reversed, his Lightning answered instantly. No fighting the stick, no fractional delay that had doomed so many before. The airplane felt alive, responsive, like a thoroughbred instead of the heavy truck pilots joked about. 1-0 overcommitted, bleeding speed in a too-tight reversal. Hayes got inside its turn at 200 feet range, point blank. He couldn't miss. His guns tore the fighter apart. Aluminum fragments peppered his right boom as the Zero disintegrated mid-air. The fourth Zero broke off and fled north. Hayes, low on fuel and ammunition, did not pursue. He climbed back to altitude, reforming with the battered remnants of his flight. The entire engagement had lasted just 7 minutes. At 09:03, the damaged but victorious Lightning touched down at Dobodura, its props kicking up clouds of coral dust from the runway. McKenna was already waiting on the flight line, heart in his throat, grease-blackened hands clenched at his sides. Hayes shut down the engines, the props winding down to silence. He climbed from the cockpit on shaky legs, flight suit soaked through, face pale but eyes bright with disbelief. He walked straight to McKenna and spoke only 2 words, voice hoarse. It worked. What neither man knew yet was that 6 other pilots circling at 15,000 feet had witnessed the entire fight. Captain Frank Mitchell, a veteran flight leader from the 475th Fighter Group, had seen it all: the impossibly quick rolls, the snap reversals that no P-38 should have been capable of. Hayes wasn't suddenly a superhuman ace. Something had changed about his airplane. Captain Frank Mitchell had watched the entire fight from 15,000 feet, his own element orbiting high above the chaos unfolding over the Huon Gulf. At 28, Mitchell was already a hardened flight leader in the 475th Fighter Group, with 2 tours in the Southwest Pacific and the weary eyes of a man who had buried too many friends. From his vantage, the diving P-38s looked like silver darts slicing through the bright morning sky, but something about Hayes' aircraft stood out immediately. The Lightning rolled with unnatural quickness, snapping through bank angles that no P-38 Mitchell had ever seen could achieve. The reversals came too fast, too clean. The Zero pilots, masters of timing after months of exploiting the Lightning's sluggish ailerons, were caught flat-footed. Hayes reversed inside their turns before they could complete their own maneuvers. Mitchell counted 3 confirmed splashes in under a minute, each one accompanied by the distant flash of exploding fuel and the slow spiral of debris toward the jungle below. The air at altitude was thin and cold, the cockpit canopy frosting slightly at the edges despite the tropical sun. Mitchell's own P-38 vibrated steadily under full power, the twin booms humming with the familiar drone of the Allisons. He keyed his microphone once to his wingman. "You seeing this? Number 3's moving like a goddamn fighter, not a truck." His wingman acknowledged, voice crackling with surprise. They had lost 4 pilots from their flight in the past month alone. Good men torn apart in the very turning fights the Zeros forced so expertly. Mitchell had watched each one die, helpless from above, the same sluggish rolls sealing their fate. Now, this. Back on the ground at Dobodura, the flight line buzzed with activity as the returning Lightnings taxied in. Dust swirled in thick clouds from the coral runway, mixing with the acrid scent of cordite and hot metal from gun barrels still cooling. Mitchell landed shortly after Hayes, his own aircraft untouched. He taxied to his revetment, cut the engines, and climbed down, his flight boots crunching on the loose coral. Without pausing to debrief his crew chief, he strode directly toward the ready room where Hayes was already hunched over his combat report, hands still shaking from adrenaline, sweat staining the paper beneath his pen. 3 confirmed kills scrawled in hasty pencil. Mitchell pulled up a chair, his flight suit stiff with dried sweat and the faint smell of rubber from his oxygen mask. "What the hell was different out there, Hayes?" he asked without preamble, voice low to avoid drawing the attention of other pilots nearby. "You rolled like you had a different airplane under you. I've seen every pilot in this theater. You're good, but you're not that good. Maintenance do something to your bird?" Hayes hesitated, then met Mitchell's gaze. The younger pilot's face was still flushed, eyes wide with the raw intensity of survival. "Talk to Technical Sergeant McKenna," he said simply. "He'll know." 2 hours later, Mitchell found McKenna in the maintenance area, elbow deep in the engine nacelle of another Lightning. The sergeant's hands were black with grease and hydraulic fluid, his coveralls stained and torn at the elbows from weeks of crawling through tight booms. The hangar smelled of solvent and scorched wiring, the tropical heat amplifying every odor until it pressed against the skin. Tools clattered on the workbench nearby, and distant shouts from the armorers echoed across the field. Mitchell didn't waste time. "What did you do to Hayes' airplane?" he asked point blank. stepping close enough that McKenna could see the intensity in his eyes, the look of a man who had lost too many subordinates to the same flaw. McKenna straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag that did little to clean them. He studied Mitchell for a long moment, weighing the risk. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he explained, "The slack in the aileron cables, the 3/8-inch play that created the fatal delay, the piano wire Z tensioner he had fabricated and installed the night before. No authorization, no engineering drawings, just 8 minutes of work in the dead of night that eliminated the lag completely." Mitchell listened without interrupting, arms crossed, the weight of regulation and potential court-martial hanging unspoken between them. When McKenna finished, Mitchell asked the question that would set everything in motion, "Can you do the same to mine?" McKenna warned him of the risks: untested in prolonged combat, non-standard part, violation of every maintenance manual. If the tensioner failed or caused a cable snap, both men could face charges. Mitchell didn't flinch. "I've lost 4 pilots this month, all of them caught because they couldn't roll fast enough. If this gives us a chance, regulations can wait." That evening, after dark, McKenna repeated the process on Mitchell's P-38. Same salvaged piano wire, same cramped work inside the boom, same careful testing by hand. Mitchell flew the modified aircraft the next morning on a routine sweep. He returned raving to his wingman on the flight line. "It rolls like a fighter instead of a truck. The stick moves and the wings answer immediately, no fighting it, no delay." The wingman, who had flown with Mitchell for months, demanded the modification next. By August 20th, McKenna had quietly altered 9 aircraft across the squadron. Whispers spread in the ready room and maintenance tents, pilots asking their crew chiefs in hushed tones if they had heard about the cable fix. Some chiefs refused outright, citing regulations. Others, seeing friends die, took the risk and learned the 8-minute procedure from McKenna. The change was invisible to outsiders, but the pilots who flew the modified Lightnings felt it in their bones. Hayes himself scored 2 more zero kills on August 22nd, the responsive controls allowing him to stay inside enemy reversals that would have previously left him vulnerable. The secret held for now. The secret held for now. Within days, the improvement rippled through the squadron like a current through the humid air of New Guinea. Captain Frank Mitchell's modified P-38 proved the point beyond doubt. On his next mission, a sweep over Oro Bay, he engaged a flight of 6 Zeros at 14,000 feet. The Lightning rolled with a crispness that surprised even Mitchell himself. The stick input translated instantly into wing movement, allowing him to reverse inside an enemy's turn and claim 2 quick kills before the remaining Zeros could adjust. His wingman, watching from close formation, landed demanding the same treatment. McKenna obliged that same evening, repeating the 8-minute ritual in the shadowed hangar, salvaged piano wire bent into a Z, inserted as an inline tensioner, tested by hand for 0 slack. The added 0.4 pounds of preload felt insignificant on the ground, but in the sky it transformed the heavy fighter's handling. By August 20th, 9 aircraft in the squadron flew with the hidden modification. Pilots began seeking out their crew chiefs in quiet corners of the ready room or between revetments, voices lowered against the constant drone of generators and the chatter of ground crews. "Heard anything about a cable fix?" they asked. Some chiefs shook their heads firmly, reciting regulations like a shield. Others, haunted by empty bunks and the memory of friends screaming over the radio, pulled McKenna aside after dark. He demonstrated patiently, cut the wire, bend the precise angles with pliers, installed deep inside the boom where inspectors rarely probed. The tensioner vanished from sight once panels were replaced. No paperwork, no signatures, just whispered instructions passed mechanic to mechanic. The results were impossible to ignore. Lieutenant Robert Hayes, still riding the adrenaline high of his 3-kill day, took off on August 22nd and added 2 more Zeros to his tally during a fierce scrap over Finchhaven. The responsive controls let him stay inside, scissoring enemies, snapping through reversals that previously would have left him lagging fatally. Captain Mitchell scored 3 confirmed victories on August 25th, his flight returning with only minor damage instead of the usual riddled booms and smoking engines. Other pilots who flew the modified Lightnings began coming home with kills instead of excuses. The ready room walls, once plastered with grim loss tallies, started filling with fresh victory claims penciled in hasty script. Word traveled beyond the immediate squadron. Lieutenant James Watkins, a crew chief with the 49th Fighter Group at Guisop Airfield, heard the rumor from a transferred pilot who had flown from Dobodura. Skeptical at first, too many miracle fixes had proven false. Watkins tried it on a single aircraft late one humid night. The pilot returned from his next mission, ecstatic, crediting his first kill after 8 weeks of fruitless combat. Watkins modified 4 more before the week ended. Soon, crew chiefs across the 49th were quietly adopting the procedure, hiding the piano wire tensioners before any inspection by removing them temporarily and reinstalling afterward. Control cable tensions always read within spec during official checks. The engineering officer at Dobodura noticed inconsistent readings in some logs, but chalked it up to field conditions. He never suspected deliberate tampering. The statistics shifted dramatically. In July, American pilots in the Southwest Pacific had lost 2 P-38s for every 0 destroyed, a grim 2-to-1 exchange that bled the 5th Air Force dry. By late August, the ratio had narrowed to 1.3 to 1 as modified aircraft began dominating turning engagements. September brought near parity, with P-38s claiming kills at rates that stunned intelligence officers poring over after-action reports. Pilots who had once dreaded the call to engage Zeros now climbed into their cockpits with renewed confidence, knowing their aircraft could answer when the fight turned violent and low speed. Yet the change remained invisible to outsiders. No new parts lists, no revised maintenance manuals, no official briefings, just enlisted men and junior pilots quietly defying doctrine to survive. McKenna continued his work in the maintenance area, hands perpetually black with grease, the smell of avgas and hot metal his constant companion. He watched more Lightnings taxi out each dawn, their pilots waving the same determined gestures Hayes had given weeks earlier. Fewer returned in boxes. The tropical night still carried the distant rumble of Japanese raiders, but McKenna's stomach clenched less tightly now. The modification was spreading, one piano wire at a time, altering the balance in a theater where every second counted. The engineering officer remained oblivious, focused on fuel consumption and ammunition loads. The secret held, buying precious time for the Americans and sowing confusion among the enemy. The secret held, buying precious time for the Americans and sowing confusion among the enemy. Far across the Huan Gulf, at Japanese airfields carved from the jungle around Wewak and Rabaul, the first unsettling reports began filtering in during late August 1943. Pilots of the 11th Air Fleet gathered in bamboo huts that smelled of damp canvas, cigarette smoke, and the ever-present mildew, poring over mission debriefs under the harsh glare of kerosene lanterns. Their voices carried a note of frustration absent in earlier months. American P-38 Lightnings were suddenly maneuvering more aggressively, rolling into turns with unexpected speed, reversing direction more quickly than the familiar sluggish response the Zero pilots had exploited for so long. Tactics that had worked reliably, drawing the heavier Lightning into a sustained horizontal turn, then snapping back inside its wider radius to latch onto the tail, were failing. The Americans still dove from altitude and zoomed away when possible, but when forced into close combat, their twin-boom fighters now answered the controls with a crispness that disrupted Japanese timing perfectly calibrated from months of experience. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most celebrated aces with 64 confirmed kills since Pearl Harbor, felt this shift firsthand on September 3, 1943, over Wewak. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the airfield as Sakai strapped into his A6M0. The lightweight fighter's cockpit cramped but familiar, the scent of avgas sharp in the humid air. At 31, Sakai carried the quiet confidence of a veteran who had dominated American pilots in turning fights for years. His Zero was agile, responsive to the lightest touch on the stick, capable of twisting through maneuvers no P-38 could match. Today's patrol was routine. Intercept incoming American sweeps threatening supply lines. Climbing to 15,000 feet, Sakai spotted a lone P-38 straggling below. He smiled faintly beneath his oxygen mask, the perfect bait. He dove in aggressively, using his standard tactic, draw the Lightning into a turning engagement, wait for its roll to begin, then reverse sharply the opposite way to cut inside its radius and line up a killing deflection shot. The Zero's controls felt alive under his hands, the horizon spinning smoothly as he initiated the lure. The American pilot committed to the turn, rolling left as expected. Sakai waited the precise fraction of a second. He had practiced dozens of times, then snapped his own stick hard, right to reverse and slip inside. Except the P-38 reversed with him, faster than any Lightning Sakai had ever faced. The big fighter's wings bit the air instantly, its nose slicing through the horizon in a blur that caught Sakai completely off guard. He had executed this maneuver flawlessly for months, knowing exactly how long a P-38 needed to roll. The timing was etched into his muscle memory. But this one rolled quicker, fractionally but decisively enough to spoil his inside position. Sakai barely avoided a head-on collision, the silver boom of the lightning flashing past his canopy close enough to see the pilot's helmeted head. The American got guns on him almost immediately, tracers streaking past, the distinctive hammer of 4 calibers, and the heavier bark of the 20mm cannon. Sakai shoved his throttle forward and dove away sharply, the Zero shuddering under maximum power as he broke off the engagement. He returned to base shaken, the usual post-mission elation replaced by confusion and frustration. Other experienced Zero pilots reported identical encounters in the following days. The Americans weren't adopting new tactics. They flew the same hit-and-run doctrine, but their aircraft now responded faster in the critical low-speed reversals and rolls. The delay that Japanese pilots had learned to exploit, the hesitation that gave them the edge, had vanished. Intelligence teams examined wreckage from downed P-38s dragged from the jungle, but found nothing obvious. Engines identical, armament unchanged, control surfaces rigged to standard specifications. No new gadgets, no visible modifications. The change was hidden, tucked deep inside the booms. A 6-inch piece of piano wire that looked like any other component. Even if discovered, it would have seemed insignificant, just a minor adjustment to cable tension. The psychological toll mounted rapidly. For nearly 2 years, Zero pilots had owned the skies in sustained turning fights, their superior agility instilling unshakable confidence. Now that assurance cracked. Pilots who once pressed attacks aggressively grew cautious, hesitant, second-guessing maneuvers that had once been automatic. Some abandoned turning fights altogether, adopting hit-and-run tactics themselves. But that surrendered the Zero's greatest strength, forcing them to fight on American terms where the Lightning's speed, firepower, and durability held the advantage. Others compensated with reckless aggression, closing to dangerously short ranges before firing or taking risks to regain the initiative. But without the ability to outturn the enemy reliably, aggression only accelerated their losses. By the end of September, the 11th Air Fleet had lost 38 fighters in combat with P-38s, while American losses stood at just 22 aircraft. The exchange ratio had reversed dramatically. Japanese command issued new orders, avoid engaging P-38s unless holding a significant numerical advantage. The Zero had shifted from hunter to hunted in the Southwest Pacific skies. The fundamental problem was invisible, an unseen modification the enemy could not identify or counter. Tactics could not be developed against a change no one understood existed. Tactics could not be developed against the change no one understood existed. Back at Dobodora, the illusion of secrecy finally cracked in early October 1943. The engineering officer, a meticulous major named Ellis, had grown suspicious of inconsistent cable tension readings logged during routine inspections. Some P-38s showed slightly higher preload than factory specs allowed, others perfectly nominal. He ordered a deeper spot check on 3 aircraft in the 475th Fighter Group. Crew chiefs, anticipating the scrutiny, had quietly removed the piano wire tensioners the night before, reinstalling them only after the panels were sealed. The readings came back with intolerances. Ellis remained uneasy but filed no formal complaint, yet. The breaking point came during a surprise maintenance audit by a visiting inspector from 5th Air Force Headquarters. On October 12th, while examining a Lightning in the 49th Fighter Group at Guseop, the inspector crawled deep into the left boom with a flashlight and mirror. There, wedged between pulley and cable end, he spotted the Z-shaped piece of piano wire. It looked innocuous, nothing more than a makeshift shim, but the preload it created exceeded specifications by 0.4 pounds. He photographed it, removed the device carefully, and impounded the aircraft. Within 48 hours, a typed report was on its way up the chain. Unauthorized modification to flight control system, potential safety hazard, violation of Army Air Force's Technical Order W-25-225, NON, and Lockheed Engineering directives. The report landed on desks in Brisbane, then Washington, triggering heated debates behind closed doors in Quonset huts and air-conditioned offices. Punish the mechanics for gross insubordination and risk morale collapse in forward squadrons, or quietly approve the change after the fact, given the measurable improvement in kill ratios and pilot survival. Squadron commanders flooded headquarters with after-action summaries showing modified aircraft achieving 1.5 to 1 or better exchange rates against zeros. Pilots like Hayes and Mitchell submitted sworn statements. The responsive controls had saved their lives multiple times. The data was undeniable, but regulations were absolute. No field mechanic was authorized to alter primary flight controls. In November, Lockheed dispatched a three-man engineering team to New Guinea aboard a C-47 transport. They arrived at Dobodura under the baking equatorial sun, stepping off the plane into the familiar stench of avgas and jungle rot. The team, two civilian engineers from Burbank and a military liaison, spent 10 days crawling through booms, measuring cable tensions with precision gauges, calculating stress loads under simulated combat maneuvers, and running flight tests on both modified and stock P-38s. McKenna was summoned to demonstrate the installation process under supervision, his hands steady despite the scrutiny. He explained the 3 8-inch slack, the fractional delay and hard rolls, the piano wire solution born of necessity. The engineer's verdict, delivered in a classified memo dated November 28th, was unequivocal. The modification was safe, effective, and should have been incorporated into the original design. The added preload eliminated the unacceptable play without risking cable fatigue or structural failure under combat loads. Lockheed immediately began integrating a factory-engineered tensioning system, similar in principle but using approved materials and standardized fittings, into the upcoming P-38J model rolling off assembly lines in December 1943. The improvement would reach frontline squadrons by early 1944, retrofitted where possible on existing aircraft. No commendations were issued to McKenna or the other enlisted men involved. The official Lockheed documentation attributed the control system enhancement to engineering analysis and field data feedback. McKenna's name never appeared. The mechanics who had risked court-martial received only quiet nods from grateful pilots and the unspoken understanding that regulations had bent in the face of survival. By the time the first P-38Js arrived in theater, the piano wire era had already saved dozens of lives, shifting the air war in the Southwest Pacific in ways the engineers in California could never have foreseen from their drafting tables. The modification had bought the Americans time that allowed pilots like Hayes to rack up victories and live to fight another day. But the war was far from over. The modification had bought the Americans time that allowed pilots like Hayes to rack up victories and live to fight another day. But the war was far from over. For Lieutenant Robert Hayes, the hidden tensioner marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Pacific. The desperate farm boy from Iowa who had faced near-certain death on August 17th became a confident, aggressive pilot. The aircraft that had once felt like a sluggish truck now answered his commands with the immediacy he needed. He flew with renewed purpose, leading flights, mentoring younger pilots, and adding steadily to his tally. He completed 63 combat missions in total, finishing the war with 11 confirmed aerial victories and a chestful of decorations, the Distinguished Flying Cross among them. He returned to Iowa in 1945, his hands still occasionally trembling with a phantom tremor from the adrenaline of 100 dogfights, but his heart full. He married his high school sweetheart, bought a small crop-dusting business, and for 37 years crisscrossed the Iowa cornfields in a rickety biplane that smelled of pesticide and oil, a peaceful echo of the twin-boom fighter he had once nursed through tropical skies. Every August 17th, without fail, he would place a long-distance call to a phone number in California, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you, Sergeant," he would say. "Thank you for giving me my life back." Captain Frank Mitchell, the veteran who had seen the impossible and demanded the fix for himself, also survived the war. He commanded a squadron through the brutal Philippines campaign, his own kill count climbing to 16. He stayed in the newly formed United States Air Force, rising to the rank of colonel before retiring in 1963. In every command, he carried the lesson learned under the Dobodura sun. The best solutions often come not from the top down, but from the men with grease under their fingernails. He made a point of telling the story of the piano wire tensioner to every young maintenance officer and engineering graduate he encountered, ensuring the unofficial history was passed on, a parable about trusting the expertise of the enlisted men who lived with the machines every day. And what of Technical Sergeant James McKenna? He finished his tour in New Guinea, the oppressive heat, the smell of decaying jungle and hot metal, the sound of distant engines forever etched into his memory. He mustered out of the Army Air Forces in 1946, a civilian once more. He returned to Long Beach, California, the city of his youth now bustling in the post-war boom. He went back to what he knew best, working on engines. With his mustering out pay and a small loan, he opened McKenna's garage in a quiet neighborhood in 1948. For the next 42 years, he diagnosed carburetors, tuned engines, and replaced transmissions, his hands still scarred from that night in the hangar, moving with the same methodical precision. He rarely spoke of the war. When asked, he'd simply shrug in his oil-stained coveralls and say, "I was a mechanic, fixed airplanes." That's all. The obituary for his wife Clara in 1985 listed him as a retired auto mechanic and WW-8D FE veteran. There was no mention of P-38s, of a secret that changed an air war, of lives saved by a piece of salvaged wire. The garage continued to operate, the scent of gasoline and rubber a permanent fixture in the air, a different kind of shop smell that had long since replaced the jungle-tinged aroma of Dobodura. Then, in 1991, a military historian named Dr. Alan Pritchard, researching obscure field modifications for a book on Pacific theater innovation, stumbled across a single sentence in a declassified maintenance log from the 475th Fighter Group. It cryptically noted, "Aileron cable preload adjusted per field expedient for an aircraft in August 1943. The trail, cold for nearly 50 years, led him to veteran reunions, faded squadron rosters, and finally to a small, sun-bleached garage in Long Beach. James McKenna was 73 years old, still coming in 3 days a week, his hair white, his hands gnarled with arthritis, but his eyes sharp. At first, he was reticent, dismissive. But as Pritchard laid out his research, the correlation between the modifications spread and the plummeting loss rates in late 1943, McKenna slowly nodded. He confirmed the story, his voice a low rumble as he described the slack, the fear in Hayes's eyes, the weight of the pliers in his hand that night. It wasn't anything special, he insisted, just something that needed doing. We were losing boys. Pritchard's subsequent analysis estimated that the piano wire modification, by improving the P-38's survivability in turning fights, may have directly saved between 80 and 100 American pilots' lives in the latter half of 1943 alone. When he presented this figure to McKenna, the old man was silent for a long time, looking out the garage door at the California sunlight. "I never counted," he said finally. "I just remembered the ones who came back. That was enough. I just remembered the ones who came back. That was enough." James McKenna passed away peacefully in his sleep in 2006 at the age of 88. He was buried with simple military honors at Pacific View Memorial Park in Corona del Mar, California. His obituary in the local paper was brief: beloved husband, father of 2, grandfather of 4. Veteran of the U.S. Army Air Forces, World War II. Owner of McKenna's garage for 42 years. It contained no mention of piano wire, aileron cables, or Lieutenant Robert Hayes. His legacy, in the official record, was that of a mechanic who served his country and then came home to fix its cars. McKenna's garage in Long Beach changed hands a year later, sold to a young couple who converted it into an eco-friendly auto repair shop specializing in hybrid vehicles. They painted the exterior a fresh green, installed bright LED lighting, and cleared out decades of accumulated parts and tools. But during the renovation, tucked in the back of a rusted filing cabinet behind a stack of obsolete parts catalogs from the 1970s, they found a single photograph. It was a small, black and white image, its edges frayed and its surface clouded with time. It showed a young man in oil-stained coveralls, a worn cap pushed back on his head, standing casually with one hand resting on the nose of a P-38 Lightning. The twin booms stretched out behind him, and the fighter's distinctive fuselage pod gleamed dully in what looked like harsh, tropical sunlight. The man wasn't smiling, but there was a quiet confidence in his posture, a sense of ownership over the formidable machine beside him. On the back, in faded pencil, was written, "Dobodura, New Guinea, Aug 1943. My bird." The new owners, unaware of the story it held, framed it and hung it on the wall in the customer waiting area, a nod to the building's history. It sits there still, a silent relic overlooking a world of diagnostic computers and electric motors, a ghost from an era of ingenuity born of sheer necessity. That is how innovation truly happens in war. Not in the well-lit conference rooms of corporate headquarters, or through the slow grind of official channels and engineering committees. It happens in the mud, the grease, and the desperate darkness. It is forged by sergeants and mechanics who see a fatal flaw not as a line item in a specification sheet, but as a preventable cause of empty bunks. It is carried out by men willing to trade the certainty of regulations for the chance to save the life of the kid from Iowa in the cockpit. The piano wire tensioner was never a celebrated invention. It never won a design award or changed aircraft engineering on a grand theoretical scale. But on a tactical human level, it was revolutionary. It restored a fractional second of response time, and in the brutal calculus of aerial combat, that fraction was everything. It turned a potential coffin into a weapon that could fight on its enemy's terms. It gave pilots back the one thing doctrine could not, a fighting chance in the turn. The story of James McKenna and the modified P-38 is a testament to the unrecorded heroes of any conflict. The troubleshooters, the tinkerers, the enlisted men who understand the machines of war in their bones. Their solutions are often temporary, unofficial, and buried in the forgotten footnotes of history. But their impact echoes in the lives that stretched on long after the guns fell silent, in the children and grandchildren of the men who came home because a mechanic dared to fix something everyone else said was working as designed. So the next time you hear the distant drone of an aircraft or smell gasoline and hot oil, remember that sometimes the course of history hinges not on grand strategies, but on a tired man in a humid hangar, bending a stolen piece of wire by flashlight, choosing to save a life over following a rule.